Yeah.
Oh no!
Quick, we can hide under here.
So have you got everything that you need?
Yes, thank you.
Everything that you need? Sue? Have
Sorry?
you got everything that you need?
I have, thank you.
All right.
If there, I'm going to use my phone as a timer, but the trouble is it goes dark. So if there was a little timer clock I could stick in front of me, that's going to be...
10 minutes.
Sorry?
You've got 10 minutes to talk.
Yeah.
I'm sitting there. Do you want me to give you a 5?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a 1, or a 2 and a
2.
1?
Yeah.
2 and a 1. Yeah,
Great.
That's really helpful.
5, a 2 and a 1.
Yeah.
Thank
Where,
you.
where are you sitting?
No.
Just,
I'm just going to ignore you.
I mean,
Mine's not quite 10 minutes.
I just know when I get talking, I just don't feel time go.
Seasoned pro. Yes. Technical issues.
That's why I wrote all of mine out.
There's Tim.
I've only written that much. It's not quite written. It's just remembering to speak slowly for yourself. That's the most important thing. Because I've been to conferences this week and you've been like that. It's just really, really hard. I tried to cut as much of that out as I could, but it's really hard.
Tickets.
Oh, are they?
Yes.
Oh, moving the table. Sorry. I just have to sit slightly the other way.
Someone
Yeah.
doesn't have a
I was
ticket.
trying
You don't
to
want them
sit
being
so I'm
turned away.
turning towards you, but because of my chair, I'm going to have to sit like that so I can get close to the. It's more my my control pod.
Everyone's been teasing me.
You've certainly catered for everyone's personal space.
I know. We're so good like that. There's plenty of room for when you need to dive under the table. I knew that had happened. Everyone would sit on the back table. It's all my colleagues as well.
If for whatever reason there's any problem with the mics, the rolling mic you've got, you can get it out to whoever's talking on the back, which is going to stop anything being missed for all the people that are watching. Alright.
Do you, if that did happen, is there another roving mic that we would use when it comes to the Q&A section, or is it just this one?
I think it's probably going to be that one.
Okay,
Alright,
that's fine. Yeah,
but we'll use it as
I'm ready to run.
Yeah, we were saying that actually.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah. Everybody's like anticipation.
I know.
afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Midlands Arts Centre. Thank you so much for being here and making this conversation happen. I'm Trish Wheatley. I'm the Chief Executive of Disability Arts Online. Just a quick housekeeping thing to begin with. If there is a fire alarm, there are lots of staff in the room who will guide you to the nearest exit. There's toilets through this door over here, and it's a relaxed event, so if you need to stand up, move around, or go in and out at any point, then that's fine, because we're not having a break. Also, when it comes to audience participation, comments and questions, if you could please wait for the microphone and speak slowly and clearly so that our captions operate correctly, and so that our audience online can also hear what you're saying. Thank you. So Disability Arts Online is an organisation that is led by disabled people. We're an arts organisation that exists to support and promote disabled artists, and we critique arts and culture from a disability perspective. We're new to the Arts Council's national portfolio this year, and this is enabling us to put on events like this, support the sector in working with disabled artists and being more accessible to audiences. And it also enables us to work more closely with artists, and this year we've started a new Associate Artist programme, and Aidan Moesby is one of those artists. The event is happening here today because of Sue's exhibition in the main space. Sue Austin's an artist who's on our panel today. So if you haven't been able to see the exhibition yet, there is an opportunity immediately after the event today. I just want to take this opportunity, because I won't be speaking again, to thank the staff at MAC. They've been amazing in setting up this event for us and hosting, and also to thank the DAO team as well. So we've got two staff in the room, that's Joe and Kathy, and we also have LD and Colin, who are encouraging the debate online as well. The hashtag for the event is Interrogating Invisibility. Sorry, I'll just say that again. So the hashtag... Hello. It doesn't want a hashtag, no. Okay, I'll try that again. It's Interrogating Invisibility. And also on our Facebook group, there is a pinned post where our conversations are happening. Please fill in the feedback forms. Now we're an MPO, we really need the feedback and evidence of the work that we're doing. And I hope you all enjoy this afternoon.
Thanks, Trish. I'd like to thank everybody for coming for the wedding of the artists and curators. So I'm Aidan Moesby. I'm an artist and curator. I identify as somebody with a disability. And thanks to DAO, Disability Arts Online, and MAC Birmingham for allowing this event to take place. I'm amazingly excited, if not a little bit anxious, about having the panel and having this conversation. And bear in mind that it is a conversation. It's not just us talking at you for 2 hours. So I'm going to ask each of the panel members to talk for 10 minutes on the provocation of the invisibility and representation and invisibility of disabled artists and their take. And we've got very diverse views from somebody who doesn't identify as having been through the traditional system through to curators in institutions. If I could just briefly ask the panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Sue.
Hello, my name's Susan Austin. I'm a multimedia performance and installation artist, but the key thing is it's a socially engaged practice.
Hi, I'm Ashley. I think it's me who's causing the crackling, unfortunately. I am an artist, and I have come up through the non-traditional route, I guess.
Hi, I'm Jess Litherland, and I'm the visual arts producer here at MAC.
Hello, my name is George Vasey. I'm a curator at the Welcome Collection.
Thank you. So just to give a bit of context, presumably you read the bump and so you kind of know why you're here. But just in case you haven't, I'm going to give you a bit of context about why I wanted to hold this conversation. And part of it is because of my own personal experience about being an artist. And I didn't come up through a traditional art kind of background. I wasn't an artist. I haven't been to art school. And so everything I've learned has been by a non-traditional method. And I've found certain issues with working inside the traditional art kind of establishment and identifying as somebody with a disability. So I am really concerned about the lack of representation and the invisibility of disabled artists, and how traditionally as a disabled person you're viewed as somebody who doesn't have any cultural, social, economic value. And then within the art establishment, once you say that you're disabled, then you tend not to have any professional or creative or aesthetic or economic value within the art world either. And it tends to be that when the only time that you get put into a traditional art institution is if there's been some kind of workshop and you're in that corridor heading towards the toilets. Very, very rarely do artists get put in, or disabled artists get put into main galleries in mainstream institutions. And once a D word is used as a descriptor, then as an artist we cease to have any credibility. We have no cultural, aesthetic, artistic, creative or professional value. Over recent years, we've seen the position of disability-led performance elevated to the stage where it sells out mainstream venues to mainstream audiences. And this, in part, is down to the success of Unlimited. However, the same uplift hasn't occurred with object-based visual artists. The status of object-based visual artists who were traditionally shown within a normative gallery context are victims to an outmoded trope of the day center method, and that we produce really poor work that is, oh, it's not bad for a disabled person, but we'd never get into a gallery. And within the art world, and I mean of disabled artists, and I make the distinction between artists with disabilities and the political movement of disability arts, there's been and remains a lack of critique and a lack of willingness to engage by the mainstream. So if there's no critique and no willingness to engage, how can we change that situation? How can we improve or develop if we're not having meaning, honest, open conversations around our work? Is the mainstream still the only show in town? Are there ways of being sustainable and successful, whatever that means to the individual artist, and beyond the traditional gallery approach and the Power 100? So on Wednesday, I did a search on Tate.org, and disability artists, 44 results, disabled curators, 19 results. And many of these aren't events or are events rather than people. Cats, 197. Dogs, 644. Curators, 4,400, and artists, nearly 18,000. So out of 18,000 artists referenced on the Tate website, 0.3% of them are about disability. So we're not here today to be a stick. I much prefer the kind of carrot approach. So how can we start to change and think constructively around changing that stat and to engage more institutions and more people to kind of embrace the whole disability arts world? How can we make how can we make a successful marriage between artists and curators? Thank you. So I'm going to ask Jess to kick us off with that provocation. Each member will have 10 minutes. Jess, thanks.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? I'll try not to tap the mic. I'm a bit of a fiddler, so I'll try not to do that. It's really nice to see everyone here. Thank you for joining us today. I don't know how many people are first-time visitors to MAC. If you are, welcome. And for those of you who join us again, welcome back. I thought to start with, I'd talk a little bit about my career and my background, just to sort of give you an idea of my context and where I come from with my curating. So I've been working in the arts for 17 years. I always loved art when I was younger and originally followed quite a traditional path through college. Even though I was never very academic, I did a BTEC diploma. I went to university and originally I trained as an artist. and did a degree in fine art. I spent some time working as an artist, and painting was my thing. And I worked multiple jobs as a volunteer in a gallery, doing all kinds of odd jobs, painting walls, making coffees, and learning as much as I could, as a gallery assistant and in a shop. I moved into curating in a gradual way, learning on the job from some amazing curators who had lots of experience and took me under their wing. And leading on from my volunteering, I got a job in a local authority-run gallery, and that was pretty much straight out of university, and then worked my way around the Midlands at various galleries. So my experience is predominantly local authority-run, smaller-scale galleries and museums until I arrived here at MAC, which is very different to what I've done before. And along the way, I completed 2 master's degrees. So looking at my own path in practice, both as an artist and as a curator, there's a lot of privilege there. I've benefited from being able to move around a lot, to study while working full-time, being able to take on volunteer work. For the most part, I've been in a position where I've been able to play the art world game of chasing down opportunities, the need we have in this sector to prove ourselves with dedicating our time for working for free or volunteering or interning. So things I think a lot about in relation to my work is that I take it very seriously. As a public gallery curator, I recognise my responsibility to my audiences, the artists I work with, to be responsive, to be open-minded and to be communicative. I consider my curatorial practice to be collaborative and reflective, and I think Sue and I might talk a little bit about that and our relationship developing her exhibition. I recognise my position in the system as a gatekeeper, which I think is really important, and I see that as a privilege. And I always try to be mindful of it when I'm working with artists. How do I share and distribute the power in the relationship? How do I empower artists? How can I use my sphere of influence to help artists? And also thinking about where do I look for artists for programming, and where my focus is, whether I need to try new places or new networks. And that's, again, about being really open. So thinking about the provocation of today and barriers, these are just thoughts that sort of tumbled out of my mind. Talking to the other panelists informally, I think we're all crossing over a lot on what we've been thinking. Access, inclusion and funding. All things at the top of the list. I think you've been thinking a lot about art world structures, maybe old-fashioned power structures, and the fact that my experience is predominantly as and I'm probably institutionalised to a lot of those structures, but being aware of them is the first step in trying to break out of that. Practicalities, I've been thinking about how we work with artists. If you're unable to respond to call-outs and proposal guidelines within current systems, lots of what we do is based on using specific kinds of language, which is something that Aidan and I have talked about, or art speak, as we call it, which isn't accessible if you had to take a different route to practice or if you're trying to develop a network from scratch. Also, so much of what we do is based on writing, whether that's email communications or asking for written proposals. And the funding issue comes in here as well, as a lot of disabled artists would need support to make those kinds of approaches to curators and galleries in the first place. Networking is another thing I think about a lot. The whole of our sector is about forging relationships and networking, but what if you can't actually be in the room at the events or attend meetings, or for other reasons find that kind of contact difficult? A lack of experience in the sector working with disabled artists and the confidence. We all learn by doing, and I think sometimes there's a nervousness about what working with disabled artists can include in terms of additional support and access, providing that correctly and well, and also concern about getting things wrong, like terminology. I think about support for younger artists, young disabled artists, if they're not going through the education mainstream, universities, how are they going to develop their practice and their own critical frameworks about their artwork? What about the disabled artists who haven't had an arts education? I think we'll be touching on that a little bit. My colleague Lucy, Rix is in the room, I won't point her out, had a good point to make, which was many disabled artists have perhaps come into the field later because the education system's not worked for them, or they've had to find alternative ways of studying due to their health or late diagnosis. So schemes and initiatives which are able to promote them and their work are not appropriate, as often the artist is too old, and a lot of initiatives are for under 30s. I thought that was a really good, interesting point. And the lack of critical writing about disabled artists' work. I wanted to bring in some other opinions. I asked a lot of my colleagues about the provocations for today, and I talked to an artist and director called Kate DeWright, who works here at MAC with Spectra, which is a performance company that draws on the diverse creativity of its mixed professional and learning disabled community cast to devise multisensory theatre about learning disability. And I wanted to read what Kate had written to me because I thought it was interesting to fold into the conversation. I would be interested in urging the assembled to think about how the barriers that face a physically disabled artist might be different to those that face a learning disabled artist, and perhaps even ask how well represented learning disabled artists are on such a day that is interrogating relevant questions. Are the discussions themselves inclusive to people with learning disabilities? I'm really interested in that question about spaces for critique. As part of the funding application I'm working on at the moment, and that's Kate, we're hoping to have a strand that looks at developing a framework for critical writing about performance work that includes people with learning disabilities. I think the fact that there isn't such a body of work is a major stumbling block in terms of that work being taken seriously. I can see how writing such a review, especially with no other examples, could be daunting. So we want to work to develop examples, and I think that translates across to what you were saying earlier, Aidan. A clear barrier from my perspective is that work takes longer and more support is needed, so it is more expensive to fund. I guess we're addressing this by trying to resource work properly and then evidence that doing so is good for the artists, both learning disabled and neurotypical, and the audiences. And a relatively easy, attainable thing would be to start the sea change in getting programmers to come to see the work. And this is one theme that emerged from Forge, the symposium about increasing programming of performances, including people with learning disabilities, that they ran in May. Going to see more work ourselves and getting others to see it also. So I thought that was really interesting because Kate couldn't be here today to fold that into the conversation. How am I doing for time?
A minute.
A minute. So I'm going to skip through these. What are we doing to address this? So basic access, changing how we work or how we approach our work, always learning and always being open to change. Understanding and being critical of our role as gatekeepers and checking on our own privilege. Supporting programmes which address inequality and create new opportunities. Some great DASH projects that we've been involved with, for instance, Cultivate, which is about mentoring and development of disabled artists and providing that critique. A curatorial project we've got coming up to aid representation in the curatorial sector. Co-producing a book on disabled artists' work, and across all other programmes at MAC. Supporting as much as possible earlier interventions in the system and being a critical friend. Mentoring, advice and support for students and those not travelling the educational route. Sharing opportunities widely and being as accessible as possible in how we receive proposals and develop relationships with artists. And what could be easily attainable. Sharing case studies with colleagues to encourage confidence and encourage networking with disabled artists. Curators tend to work on recommendations and talking to each other a lot, so being a positive promoter of disabled artists' work, and that's at a strategic level. So,
Sorry.
You're not going to gong me off, Aidan. I've only got 2 more lines.
Second to wrap up, that's fine.
Seeing more work, being responsive to invitations and taking artist approaches seriously. Avoid working in silos across teams within galleries and museums. Higher profile of specialist organisations and services amongst curators that they can access. Reconsider how we go about advertising and looking for artists for our programmes, and being more inclusive in staffing and on boards. And I also think that digital's got a part to play in all of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think what you say about privilege is like really, really important, and kind of acknowledging that, but then going that step further and seeing what it is that you can do to address that privilege. And I'm, you know, like thinking about putting this panel together is like trying to get a mix of diversity, and it's like I'm very, you know, yes, holding my hand up and saying it is a very white panel, but it's like trying to mix that, the privilege of like working class, outsider artists, visible disabilities, hidden disabilities, you know, it's like, yeah, as well as just like trying to get that spread about practice from the artists through to the curators. And we're only 5 people, and it's like, but we've got to start somewhere checking that privilege. So now if I can ask Sue to...
I was thinking it was Anna now.
Okay, Anna, if we can follow on from...
Yeah, I was wondering.
Yes, if we can follow on from Jess.
Okay, scheduling confusion, all sorted. Thank you so much for asking me to speak, and thank you for coming. Yeah. Am I crackling again? Can I continue?
Yeah.
Okay. I feel like blatantly I'm just going to have a bit of a rant about how the ignominious art world, you know, ignores my clearly stellar talents. So I'm going to try not to do that too much and make it kind of relevant to everybody, hopefully. There's so much to be said on this issue, and I think a lot of the barriers are sort of quite insidious and amorphous, and things to do with knowing cognitive scripts and the right language, and also attitudes from the outside towards disabled artists. So I'm going to try and focus mostly on that stuff. I want to stress at the outset that I'm speaking really based on my personal experience as an art world outsider and how my disabilities contribute to that outsiderness. My origin story is that I just kind of started making stuff. Often that stuff would be street interventions, pieces that I would just put in public space where I live, usually things like questioning the nature of the perceived reality around us. I make a lot of really big stuff, mostly on my own and mostly unfunded. So using the slightly patronising parlance of the art world, I'm self-taught. I come from a very grassroots kind of place in terms of my practice, and I definitely didn't have the cognitive script of the career route to making it in the art world. So I'd say that one of the big problems for someone of my background in gaining access to the art world is just not being able to walk the walk and talk the talk. This is partly a generalised thing about being an outsider, not having gone to art school, not having an art world network, but I think it's super relevant because I think for a lot of disabled artists, they're outside for the same reason. And if, like me, your disabilities mean that building that network and talking that talk are not realistic possibilities for you, then this is a central issue in your lack of access to and recognition within the art world. So, for example, for a lot of us, going to openings and schmoozing and networking just is not going to be a realistic proposition. So one of the main aspects to that kind of talking the talk is the skill of being able to talk about your art using words in a way that gives art world people a handle on your work. It's a pretty essential skill. I'm crap at it. I'm always going to be crap at it. And some of that is about being a person coming from a non-art background, but mostly it's about being non-neurotypical and not having a mind that finds it easy to explain the things that I can see in a way that makes sense to others. So the kind of vein of where my cognition is at is just not overlapping with the vein of where curators and gallerists and art world people are at. And what I find, and this is just my experience in the art world, is that you have to be able to step into their construction, their narrative, their world. They're not going to meet you halfway. You have to go all the way to them. And for many disabled artists like myself, it's just not really possible. And actually, I think it shouldn't have to be. I think it should be the curator's job to be able to contextualise your work within the framework that they're comfortable with. For example, the art canon narrative. As an artist, I should be free to engage with the ideas that I'm interested in my case, philosophy and politics. I want to engage with those ideas directly and not as how they relate to how other artists have previously explored them. But I don't contextualise myself in a way that the art world gatekeepers receive very well. I don't use the right language and framing for them. And actually, I'm going to be a little bit critical here, but to be honest, I'm thoroughly uninterested in doing that. I'm not interested in a kind of esoteric dialogue that appears to me to be like a sort of art crit feedback loop a lot of the time. I think a lot of the artwork gets stuck in a kind of postmodern meta place of talking in ever-decreasing circles about itself, and with less and less relevance and connection to anything outside of it. I think there's a lot of emperor's new clothes-iness, and it can, frankly, be a little bit up its own arse. But I've also found to my detriment that you don't help yourself by calling bullshit in the art world. It's a little bit po-faced. Another aspect of this is just about frames of reference. So for example, when I want to make art about quantum physics, which sometimes I do, actually most curators and gallerists don't know loads about that, and they don't really want to engage with it simply because it's unfamiliar and they're just not comfortable with it. Whereas if I were to be able to couch the piece in terms of being, you know, something to do with taking the futurist ideas of somebody or other and intersecting them with such and such a school of abstraction, then I'd be talking their language and giving them the kind of in that they can grasp onto conceptually. So it's not so much a deliberate prejudice against my art, it's a bit more insidious and subconscious than that. I'm kind of inhabiting a realm that they find hard to access and that I find hard to communicate to them. So in some ways it's an interesting counterpoint, because as a disabled person I don't have access to the art world because the art world finds much of my work inaccessible. So it's a kind of depressing extension of my relationship with the neurotypical world at large, really. And one thought I had is that an obvious way to overcome these kind of issues would be a scheme to pair disabled artists with kind of friendly curators who could couch their work in a digestible way for other curators and put artists in touch with specific art world entities who would find their work interesting. Just a thought. So that's just a few thoughts about what I would term the soft barriers, the ones that are quite hard to define and put your fingers on but are very real. In terms of the normative route to an art career, the received wisdom is that you have to be seen in London shows, you have to go to openings, meet people, you enter opens and group shows, and that's how you get on the radar. If you can't do the openings and networking, you're already kind of screwed, to be honest. And I wrote a piece for DAO about that aspect of things earlier this year. As for entering opens, I've been doing it for years, never got accepted to a single one, and you are well within your rights to suspect that that's because my art is shit. Obviously, I don't think it's that. I think it's partly that the art I'm making is different, and it's partly that the way I talk about the art I'm making is different, but in large part it's that I just can't present it to them in the way that they want. So I get really discouraged because I'm kind of cynical enough now to realise that success in the art world seems to be quite uncorrelated with the quality of people's work. And by success I mean things like gallery representation, shows, critical recognition and financial remuneration. It is much more to do with how networked in you are, how well you can explain your work so it's digestible, how good you are at branding yourself and doing social media and all of that stuff. And that, to an extent, is the case for all people in the creative industries these days. But I think it is particularly working against people with certain types of disabilities, in that if you really can't do all of that peripheral stuff, then the quality of your work is rather irrelevant to your success or lack of it. Real world example would be application forms. If you're following that standard art world career model and you need to be seen in shows, you need to apply for stuff, you need to be capable of tackling language-based forms. I can't count the number of opens I've entered never to get anywhere because I can't deliver that information in the format and the way they want it. So I sort of given up on applying for stuff without an access worker because the whole process is really soul destroying. And so few opens and residencies have a separate pot of money for access requirements, so it's just usually not an option. And the funding I have got has only been with the help of an access worker who can help jump me through that application form hoop. So you'll gather from what I've said that I haven't at all followed that normative path. Most of my work is stuff that I just make myself, including like insane 14-meter pop-up installations for underpasses. When I went to the welcome day for my unlimited R&D, I'd never even heard of a producer. I was just doing everything myself, and I didn't have any sense of the career path in art. So when I made work, I had to figure out a way on my own how to get it seen. So for example, one of my political pieces, The Political is Personal, I ended up showing it at Conway Hall in London, and that was literally from just phoning up leftist places like Unite or the Fabian Society and asking if they would show my work in an entrance hall or if they knew anywhere else they might. So it all feels like very untrodden ground and very hard work. You know, everything I've done is kind of outside of that infrastructure of the art world, the infrastructure whose gatekeepers are gallerists and curators. I almost never show anything in a gallery space, and I have a huge body of work, but it's almost entirely unconnected to dedicated art spaces. Having said that, by some interpretations, I'm doing okay. I got to show for a few days at Tate Modern with Tate Exchange, this year at the South Bank. I've done international residencies, I've shown abroad. So what more do I want, you may ask? However, many, if not all the opportunities for exposure coming my way have been through connection with disability arts. I got to show it to Exchange because of being shortlisted for the Adam Reynolds Memorial Bursary, and I showed it at South Bank because of my unlimited R&D. But the rub is, in my experience, there's no real crossover from the disability arts sector into the mainstream art world in visual arts. So I might have got some cool sounding things to put on my CV, but the bottom line is there still isn't a gallerist or curator in the country who would ever have come across me or my work. So I'm kind of perpetually stuck in this kind of parallel place to the mainstream art world, and it feels like there's this kind of gigantic river that I just can't cross. So the problem for your CV, mostly comprising disabled arts opportunities, is that they have a huge sting in the tail. When it comes to planning for wider art world success, I am advised over and over again not to mention disability because it consigns you to a kind of disability arts cul-de-sac.
Can you conclude?
I wrote an editorial last year for DEO about this, about how disability is kind of like the poor relation in the identity politics family, and it's not afforded anything like the same graceful tact and recognition about the need for representation in the wider discussion. And I feel we're kind of stuck, we're kind of women and gay people and people of colour were in the 80s, where you didn't want to shout about your identity because you were essentially making yourself a kind of niche entity outside the white male mainstream. So yeah, when it comes to disability, the perception of mainstream creators is art as a kind of therapeutic activity rather than as a rigorous and critiqued practice, like what you were saying. So yeah, I've had quite a few conversations actually with artists who are much more successful than me and disabled, who specifically won't mention it ever because they see it as such a huge disadvantage.
Is that a good place to leave it?
It is. It depends if you wanna hear about my terrible story with the curator and why I'm out and proud about being disabled now or not. But it will run over a couple of minutes, so it depends what you want.
We might come back to that.
Okay, sure.
Anna Berry, thank you. Well, that was an eloquent takedown of the art world. Thank you. But it's also refreshing just being able to have that kind of honest conversation and have it, you know, that it's okay to say those things in an arena without kind of potentially any cost. So thanks. So now we're going to hear from Sue Austin, who currently has the exhibition on next door. Sue.
So I've got a very diverse mind as well, so there is a chance I might go completely off script. But what I'm intending to talk about is give you a little background about how come I now have an arts practice and where I came from originally. The trajectory of the development of the artwork that's become kind of my life work at the moment and is an ongoing durational artwork that's somebody was saying I was riding on the tailcoats of an artwork from 2012, but to me it's about, because it's primarily conceptual, it's about keep on working and reworking it, because it's about creating a thinking space where transformation in ideas might occur, and attitudinal change takes time. So again, I'm kind of creating my own way of delivering my practice. But then I was wanting to talk about how unexpectedly that work has travelled out into the world, outside the art world really, has been largely my experience. But then now how through amazing access policies that and being able to now articulate, because of an extended period of experience, my access needs in terms of being able to engage with institutions. But the thing that underlines all of this, before I start going through those three key points, is that access policies and thinking around inclusion is the reason why I'm sitting here as an artist with a practice that has travelled out internationally. And at points I did nearly lose my practice because of the challenges around being able to get access support in place. And Mike over here, director of DASH, actually stepped into the gap. So it's an example of particular individuals, and Jess just having such a brilliant attitude with this exhibition and making it possible to adapt the normal routes you might expect an artist to follow. But particularly Mike wanted me to be involved in Incorrigibles and basically provided the access support for me to be able to be part of that book, because I didn't have it at that time. And so it's so hard. I'm finding it challenging to follow both what Aidan and Anna were saying, because my original career was in mental health. And so from that, so I'm starting the history of my background now. So my original career was in mental health, and I come to an arts practice having watched having had the experience of another career slide away. So I have a very real sense of the impermanence of life, and things can change in a moment. And I think that's completely framed my approach to my artistic practice, because for me, it's not about building a career, because I don't have that sense of permanence and growth. It's about finding something that I wanted to speak about, and then realizing those narratives that I experienced when I started using a wheelchair through a research process. There's such an extended process. I didn't start the clock. I've just realized I've got almost a terrible sense of timekeeping. Okay. So 5-6 minutes. Wow, okay. So what's the key thing to say to you then? So I think I've had a very unusual experience, because for me it's not about building a career. So while I understand what you're both saying and about representation, I would say I'm outsider in the sense that there are substantial barriers for me to be able to practice. But equally for me, they've become the gifts for me as an artist, because for me, one of the best summaries I heard from a professor presenting was talking about art being a thinking space. And as a disabled artist, I can play with the dichotomies and ambiguities in thinking about disability. That can be a barrier, but then if you can surf the ideas and in ways that that can somehow negotiate those barriers, then I think you can arrive at having this different perspective is almost an advantage over and above a normative experience of the world. As I mentioned, I lost a previous career in mental health, and then started and had the other really key thing is that I lost my mobility over 2 years, and the thing that's underpinned everything else, which is a complete coincidence and just a completely lucky instance that happened, is somebody brought a power wheelchair to my home when I'd been virtually unable to access the world. And so suddenly, just the area outside my house that would have been invisible to me before, because I'd have been running off and, you know, jumping in the car and going to work or to play squash or something, suddenly became this, there's a world out here. And the thing I remember so clearly, and if anyone's seen the TED Talk, apologies for the repetition, the feeling of the wind on my face. So I had this incredibly powerful experience of a wheelchair being my freedom. And then a process of building back out into life through the arts led eventually to studying a BA. So I'm very aware of the levels of privilege I have because of that arts education and my previous training in a BSc, so that gives me a really a research focus and a desire to interrogate things and then find solutions and then find a way of communicating the barriers that I discovered through my practice. But when I then re-emerged into the world, first of all, before I followed my arts practice, at some point I then re-emerged into the world in a wheelchair. And it was really striking. I'd be metaphorically going, hey, I'm back. And people would be going, oh, I'm so sorry about the wheelchair. And I'd be going, that's not metaphor internally, because I was kind of slightly taken aback by the response, going, but that's why I'm here. And while on one level it's not that much of an impact, but when it consistently happens to you, and then the thing talking about invisibility, a key thing for me was I realised that people weren't seeing me anymore. In some ways I was more visible in the wheelchair, but it was when I was at I can't describe, but the way of engaging with people, first of all, was so different at that point, possibly because of I bought into a series of narratives about using a wheelchair, but it felt like hitting a bit of a brick wall, and that people didn't see me anymore. And then I built out through an arts practice, and at some point wanted to explore the experience of using a wheelchair. And we're trained to be really open and flexible in our thinking, but my colleagues and tutors were saying, it's too obvious. And I was going, but not getting it. And then the penny dropped, and I went, you're assuming I mean something negative when I use the imagery of the wheelchair. I've only got 2 minutes left, so it's almost going to be impossible to cover everything. But basically, I then did some research, and I just simply asked for the first 3 words that came to mind when people saw the words, turned over a paper and saw the words NHS wheelchair. And the words that came back to me consistently were words like fear, limitation, pity, restriction, and images of barbed wire, prison bars, being tied up and so on. And it was at that point I realised that there were some very unconsidered narratives that were there in society for a reason, because it was life-changing and life-threatening in the past to be a wheelchair user. But it was the point at which I realised that people could choose to end their lives, that they were fatal, that if they bought into the narrative about disability being less of a life, whereas I would say it's a different life. I can't even start to cover how my artwork travelled out into the world. I think the most important thing to say is that my artwork, my practice exists through a series of funding to support professional disabled artists to move out into the mainstream. So it's really important to acknowledge the power of access strategies. I think for me, I have a total passion for the artwork. You might see me as the artist creating the artwork, but to me it's the artwork is beyond myself and everyone else. It's primarily conceptual. It's about transforming ideas, so it always needed to travel out into the world as far as possible. And I use it's called Creating the Spectacle. There are many layers of theory under that, including Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, which is how value is created in society. I'm being told I've run out of time, but the thing that happened to me is that because the only way I managed to find a way of transcending the narratives around the wheelchair was drawing the link between the fact that scuba gear and a wheelchair do the same thing. They enable us to extend our access out into the world, and what would happen when I put the two together. And luckily it travelled out into the world beyond the arts world, because it was called a world first. It was picked up by BBC Technology, and then we had international interviews in 2012 picked up by TEDx Women. That talk was put up as talk of the day on TED.com 28th of January 2013, changed my life. And people like NASA I've spoken at NASA, European Union, and so the strange thing now is that recognition out in the world has then led to the art world becoming interested and inviting it back in, but at a point when I have the ability to articulate the access strategies. And I have to say it's been exceptional working with Jess.
Thank you. That's a great place to leave that. Thanks, Sue. And again, just to say that the exhibition is on next door, and it certainly kind of turns the notion of privilege on its, or your talk there just turns the notion of privilege and what privilege is, and it's quite a provocation in itself. Thank you. So now finally hand you over to George Vasey.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Is it still working? It was great. so I feel a bit naked.
It wasn't quite like that.
Well, it was a conversation rather than a presentation, so I've written some notes. But what I wanted to do today was to talk a bit about my own experience in the art world, talk about a little bit about what I'm doing now, and to kind of respond to some of the questions that have come up today. It feels in some ways quite strange to be on a panel around disability and artists when I'm not an artist or would identify as disabled. But sort of reflecting on the invitation, I realised that I started off as an artist. I studied fine art originally and started doing shows in artist-led spaces. So I did that for about 6 or 7 years before I went to do a curating MA. And although I don't have a disability, I realised that a lot of people around me do, and I'd not really thought about that before. But my partner has type 1 diabetes, my parents are carers for a young girl with cerebral palsy. A lot of my expanded family have mental health issues. So it was kind of interesting to reflect on that, because I hadn't really thought about it before. But yeah, so I've been working in the art world for about 15 years. And I realised again, quite recently, that I've never had a permanent contract. You know, don't get me wrong, I've worked on some incredible projects, and in a sense, a lot of my dreams have come true. You know, I've managed to work, you know, things like the Turner Prize. I've written for the kind of magazines that I wanted to when I was starting out, and worked with some incredible artists. But it's been incredibly difficult to get to this point, and I'm on a fixed-term contract. So I realised that I spend a lot of time travelling around the UK. You know, I live between Middlesbrough and London. You know, I've often, when I was starting out, working on unpaid internships at Tate Britain, in various commercial galleries. Working, if I look back 10 years ago when I was in my mid-20s, I was doing, you know, standard 14-hour days, 7 days a week, weeks on end, you know, with like just kind of completely caning it in terms of what I felt like I could do. And this is the kind of work that's enabled me and put me in the position to be a curator in institutions. And I realised all of these things are completely prohibitive to artists with disabilities, but also, importantly, and what I'd like to talk a little bit about today is about how that also intersects with invisibility around other key issues, for instance, working class voices in the art world, the gender pay gap, the difference in opportunities that women and men have received historically, the invisibility of older artists that are unable to maintain a career longer term. So I was thinking about how, and it came up before when Anna was speaking about the notion of the construct of the art world isn't changing. And the construct of the art world, the structure that we work within, was made by ableist, white, male, middle-class men, right? This is the kind of structure that we have in place. And for a long time, when I was trying to make a career in the arts, coming from a kind of background, you know, I was the first person in my family to go to university. I certainly didn't come from a typical background to become a curator. I thought that was the structure I was trying to access. And when I got rejected or when I couldn't get a job, I often took that rejection personally. But now when I look back with a kind of hindsight and experience, I realise that actually the art world, we do need to change a lot of those structures. You know, a number of people have said today about the notion of the curator as gatekeeper, and this is something I think a lot about, that I'm actually less and less interested in my own career and practice, is thinking about how the curator, how we need to shift the notion of a curator as an author to one of somebody that listens, and that's the key skill of a curator, is understanding what's urgent within those communities and trying to learn from the people around you. I don't come here today as an expert, but I'm interested in learning. You know, when I trace back how Aidan and I first met, he posted something on Twitter, I responded to it, we met up and talked about this essay that you'd written. So I do think that if curators and institutions open themselves up to conversations, there's no reason why they can't, right? So this is something that's incredibly important to me about how I work and create kind of spaces within the programs and the exhibitions that I make, that I can bring people in and create open spaces in a sense. So I'm currently working on a year-long contract at Wellcome Collection. So I'm working on a project with looking at the estate of Joe Spence. Joe Spence was a photographer that was really active from the mid-70s through to her death in 1992. I've worked quite extensively on the Joe Spence estate, and a lot of her work deals with ideas around chronic illness and the representation of forms of disability. She often documented and used her own body in relation to being diagnosed with breast cancer in the early 80s. And alongside Joe Spence, we're working with an artist called Arik Ashri on a new commission that again is looking at kind of representation of disability and forms of chronic illness. And what's interesting about working at Wellcome, I've only been there 2 months, but it's the kind of rigour that is attached to thinking about access and how we work with artists and how we learn through those projects. So for instance, in my budget, we've put aside money for, because of the nature of the material, having money for a counsellor for myself and the artist to talk through kind of issues that we have. We've organised resilience training, working in collaboration with Samaritans and Maggie's centres to think about how we get the tone right for the exhibition. And this has been really interesting to me as a curator to think really rigorously about how we use our positions in institutions to raise the right kinds of conversations that aren't being had. What are the questions that aren't being asked, and what are the conversations that aren't happening? So that's kind of where I am at the moment. Yeah, and there was another question that was really interesting that Aidan posed to the panel, which was around the idea, do disabled artists have to follow the normative routes into representation? And I think this question is interesting, but in a sense I would say it's the wrong question. I think the question is how everybody has a responsibility to disrupt the normative forms of representation in the art world. If the structure's not working, if the construction isn't working, we have to kind of rethink those structures in some way. And I was working with an artist earlier this year, and there's this term, so she wrote her PhD on the notion of the deserve. And I was really taken by this term, because a lot of the things that have come out of the conversations today are the idea of non-typical routes into art and operating outside of the mainstream. As a curator, if you think about the oeuvre as a kind of typical art career, you know, you have a solo show, the work is bought by a collection, you have your place in history, because, you know, artists are collecting your work. A deserver is a way of thinking about a practice which is more dissident or errant, that doesn't fit the format of a solo show or collecting, but it's also a kind of way of thinking with how we work with institutions in slightly different ways. And Felicity Allen was talking about her work as a feminist artist in the 80s and 90s, and most of her commissioning coming through education programs and not exhibition programs. But I thought this deserver is a kind of way of reclaiming outsiderdom or difference as a positive thing rather than a negative thing, and how we kind of challenge kind of mainstream views in a way. And I just kind of wanted to, because there was another thing that everybody's mentioned the word privilege, and it reminded me of a quote by Tanya Bruguera, who's the most eminently quotable artist there is. And she said, the art world gives me privilege, it gives me cultural capital, and I give it away. You know, how do we translate that privilege? And this is my role, is like, what do I do with my position? And how do I translate that into being useful to other people? And that's kind of, what I'd like to say today.
Thanks, George. I mean, again, for me, it highlights the variety of what privilege is or might be. I mean, you know, you working 14 hours a day, 7 hours a week, 7 days a week, that is privilege, being able to do that. Yeah. So it's not necessarily about financial capital or, you know, whatever. It's just about being healthy, perhaps.
Yeah, certainly, and also the kind of career that I have, moving around the UK, taking on independent projects. You know, I don't have children, I don't have other responsibilities, so there are privileges. And you know, as you're saying, at a point in my mid-20s when you can do that, but not everybody can. And you know, something I didn't mention was, you know, I spent 7 years at university studying art and curating. But most of my opportunities in the art world, nobody's seen my CV. It's come through meeting people at an opening and being present And the main thing is, how do we think about other forms of visibility when you can't be present?
I mean, again, it's yeah, because that's the perceived norm, is that you go to art openings. But for some, you know, I experience incredible social anxiety, and openings just aren't my thing. So where do I meet? And how, as artists, do you manage openings or that kind of networking? You were talking about networking, Anna.
I nick a lot of white wine, stand in a corner and fail to talk to anyone large. That would be my standard experience.
I'm often not able to physically get there, so I'm kind of in a strange space in that the work I do is because people have approached me to use the art in various contexts, and often beyond the art world, but also to signify their commitment to diversity. So I kind of end up needing to focus all my energy to actually delivering those aspects of the artwork. So it was really lovely being here last night and chatting with the team from Dow and yourselves, because it just reminds me how wonderful it is to get that wider perspective. And obviously I can access things online, and I work remotely with people a great deal, so I use technology.
But that's not necessarily the same as being in the room.
No.
So finally, just before we throw it open to the floor, how did you become because if we aren't present and we can't connect with curators, how you know, as when I'm in my artist's hat on, it's like, how do I make a curator aware that I even exist if they don't answer my emails, or they don't come to my studio, or we can't get to the openings? So how, Jess, did you become aware of Sue, or how do you kind of enlarge in your kind of world in which you kind of choose to have the shows? How do you expand that?
I think it's about attending a wide variety of events yourself, and it's really hard when you're a curator and you're just one person. I mean, the visual arts program at Mac is just me. I don't have an assistant. I get lots of emails from hundreds of artists every week asking me to come to openings and to look at their emails and to look at their work. So there's a lot of demand on myself, but I try to be quite targeted about what I do go and see, so I can see a lot, or I can see things that I think will really resonate with Mac's audiences, which is my primary concern. How I found Sue was actually through Dash. And we had an amazing symposium here that we've been partnering with Dash on, called Awkward Bastards, which is a brilliant diversity conference. And Sue very kindly came and ran a masterclass here and had a kind of a version of the artwork as a kind of a pop-up version, and it just it blew me away really when I first saw it. It had a real wow factor, and just talking to Sue, we immediately hit it off, and we could see there was going to be a good working relationship there. So it was something that I kept in my mind, and when there was an availability on the programme, Sue was my first phone call.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that. So you're going to work with Dash to have a curatorial disability residency?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we've got this amazing opportunity. There's 3 partner organisations. There's ourselves at Mac, there's Arnold Feeney, and there's Mima. And we're all going to host a disabled curator for 18 months, 2 years, and we're basically going to what I'm going to attempt to do is download all of my knowledge and experience into this person, and try and open as many doors for them as I possibly can, and that's all about representation in the curatorial field.
Great. And that information will be out soon, I presume?
Very soon.
Can I add in that when Jess approached me, she immediately then made a substantial amount of funding extra to enable me to engage with the opportunity, because I was due to be doing a live art event in Adelaide, so I wasn't going to be here. And so I was saying that I explained what I would need to make it possible, but the point is she responded and completely accepted and understood that. And I think the issue is, if you're not used to working with and don't use the social model and understand a disability as constructed in the physical, practical and attitudinal barriers, then the artist is problematized and seen as more awkward to deal with than a non-disabled or more normative artist. So for me, it's so about attitude. And it's, yeah, I mean, that's for me, it's kind of like the exhibition there. I'm kind of sitting, what? Yeah. It is a sense of disbelief.
And I think it's also thank you. I think it's also partly having that space to have that conversation, because sometimes, as a disabled person, don't necessarily know what your needs are until you come across a thing that is then a barrier. And so then being able to have that space or that approach of being able to kind of, well, let's talk about it and how can we solve it, rather than just like, oh, it's not going to work.
All of my work is about making the programme accessible to artists, you know, and working in a collaborative and responsive way. And I want to be learning all the time and in a very sort of open way. Anna, I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about curators not wanting to engage with subjects, and you mentioned quantum physics, and it just really made me laugh because I had a meeting the other day with an artist who's working on a project about quantum physics, doesn't really know where it's going, but it was fascinating to me, and the part of the joy of my job is learning about all these new things. One day I'm going to be learning about scuba diving, and one day I'm going to be learning about quantum physics and something else. And so there are curators out there who are responsive to those subjects and want to learn too.
Okay, so I know we started late, but we're back on time, amazingly. So we're going to open it up to the floor. Because we're being live streamed, if we can wait until the mic is at you, because otherwise it won't get picked up. So have we got anybody who has a question? So also, if you could just say your name and where you're from to give us an idea of who's in the room.
Hi, my name's Ashok Mistry. I'm an artist. I recently wrote an article called Indivisible that was published by Disability Arts Online. And it's kind of taken over my life, and I'm a little bit kind of ambivalent towards it because it's kind of taken on it's almost like I'm taking on this thing of getting artists with invisible disabilities recognition, and I don't see it as my place to do that, but yeah, anyway. There's a whole bunch of notes that I've made, but I'm kind of going to keep it quite brief. There's issues around intersectionality where you're seen as existing within two or more groups that are seen as needing help, or, you know, kind of, I can't even kind of, comprehend my thoughts now. But I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts around intersectionality. So where you've got someone who sits within two diverse groups or two or more diverse groups, and the kind of like the barriers that they... So there's, for me, first and foremost, it's what you see. So you see this Asian guy in front of you, this brown person, and then don't actually identify with that. I identify with dyslexic, because that for me is, shall I just get rid of this? No? Okay, all right, okay. Because that is what actually defines my work. So there's issues around how people are actually being seen by curators or by the art scene. Then there's this issue around the art sector itself. I've been doing a little bit of digging, and I found that people with disabilities tend to gravitate towards the arts because it's a great, you know, kind of outlet for them. Who was it? Royal College of Art did a study amongst their cohort, and they found that it was about 29%. I spoke to a few other universities, and they were saying in the arts you have around 40% people who are who identify as dyslexic or are diagnosed as dyslexic, but that doesn't take into account other things like autism and so on and so forth.
Okay, so
they go through university.
Because it's ballooning into a
Yeah.
huge statement. I just want to catch that, the issue around intersectionality, and deal with that if I can.
Okay.
So I know that you were dealing with it. You mentioned that without even realizing, and George mentioned it about the fact that, you know, whether it's working class or women or the gender pay gap or, you know, or older people and all, you know, and it's like we have like kind of stereotypes of what that intersectionality is, but it really is that broad. You know, we don't necessarily think of age as an intersectional issue, but it can be. So have we got any quick responses?
I would say that the wheelchair is very visible, and that was one journey I went on negotiating through pursuing the identity work of acquiring a visible impairment. But I would say that the far greater barrier I face is around cognitive impairments and dyslexia, and that was what put my application for access support off the rails, because I was very honest about the level of cognitive support I need to be able to function at the level I do, and that was interpreted as meaning I couldn't be in control of my own practice, and that's in spite of, you know, quite a range of experience, and it's hard to quantify, but because the artwork has travelled out so extensively, the figures we were looking at last year, research showed us that there were around 433 million views of the artwork. Half of that was because it was used in a film called Fix, the Science Fiction of Human Enhancement as the title and end sequence, and they'd been into 223 million homes in the US. So if you assume only one person saw it in each place. But the issue is, so in the context of, I only mention it, that if with my background, if I'm being totally railroaded and assumed I have no ability to practice and direct my own access support workers, and I don't mention it underlines the privileged position I'm in, but I have a first-class degree and a master's, and I'm aware that creates structures, but equally it didn't initially overcome the barriers in this context. So I think it was about, when you have multiple intersecting experiences, it makes it much more complicated for people to understand and negotiate that. And I think that can be something to work with.
Thank you.
Create a unique voice.
Any other quick comments on that?
I think the art world tends to ghettoise lots of conversations, from age being an example of going to exhibitions where everybody's the same age and curators working with the artists of their same generation. So I've always been interested as a curator of what I would say intersecting conversations between different agendas. And I feel like a lot of the conversations that are happening online often feel very divisive and essentialized. And I think that as a curator, I think that it's important to, as I was saying, to listen. And I understand that I have lots of privileges, but there's other, as I was trying to explain in my kind of introduction, I still found it incredibly difficult to access the art world. Yeah, so I think that that's kind of where I'm interested in the conversation about those intersectional conversations between, as I was saying, you know, Black Lives Matter, gender pay gap, Me Too campaign. You know, it was interesting working last year with Lubena Hamid on Turner Prize, right? Because everybody was saying she's an older woman of colour living in Preston. What's the thing that makes what marginalises her? All of these things. And it was always the joke, it was the fact she was living in Preston that's the thing that marginalises her. I always found that very interesting. So there are various kind of forms of structural invisibilities, and it's really complicated to kind of pinpoint and to kind of drag apart. But yeah, I think it's, for me as a curator, it's about embedding well, I always use this term polyphony of different approaches on a program, so that you're getting lots of different voices and bringing lots of different voices into a program without necessarily being polemical about it. And that's kind of my approach, really.
Thanks. Can we have another couple of questions from the room, and then we'll go to social media and see what the response is from that?
Thanks. Mike from Dash. Yeah, I think probably for years I've been looking at how do you subvert the machine? How do you make change? What can we do as individuals or as organizations? And I think that's quite key in what we're talking about today, how to create that change. I was just thinking here, model organization, which is Live Art Development Agency, LADA, who are based down in London, because I think what they've done, instead of waiting for people to knock on the door and say you need to do this or that, they've realized that they're working, particularly in live art, with people who are on the margins. A lot of them are disabled artists. And so they set up events to bring disabled live artists together. They're promoting those artists. So that, you know, people like Aaron Williams and Catherine Aronello were really there. They're sort of where they got to was really part of that was the support from Live Art Development Agency. So I wouldn't say it's a laziness, but I think that thing about change, it's easy to sit back and say, yeah, we'll make change, but we want you to do it, the artists on the outside. And that's not possible. You're being funded. So the Arts Council come into this as well, because how many years will we go to a diversity conference every year and hear an apology about the numbers of disabled leaders, disabled staff, disabled board members? And how's that change going to happen? I have ideas. I don't think change like that will happen until people see a financial incentive if they don't make change. But I want to just, maybe for you all to talk about the margins, because that's a whole nother place, because the margins can be seen as a negative space to be, but I think there's also a real positive thing about the margins. So it'd just be interesting to hear what you think about that.
Okay, can we take one more question from the floor?
Hello, my name's Caitlin, and I'm from a platform called the Ashurst Emerging Artist Prize, and we're trying hard to make it more accessible. And my question is about this idea of mainstream normative routes into the arts. I do think they're glorified quite a lot, and a couple of you have sort of touched on maybe that route. And I guess my question is how you think we can potentially give more value to the margins and the things that are coming through platforms, individuals, in sort of a less traditional way, and how we can bring more value maybe to that and sort of take power away a little bit maybe from commercial galleries and institutes, which are sort of dominating what's being done.
Do you want to?
I think in terms of breaking out of normative routes, is it working? I think it's a matter of being like bold and sort of allowing yourself to think out of the box a little more, and maybe when something isn't immediately accessible to you as a curator, having a bit of good faith to come and meet it part way instead of thinking this isn't in the digestible pill that I get kind of thing, because I think that's certainly what happens to a lot of people who are a little bit out of the norm. What was the other question?
It was, well, how do you increase the value of those at the margins, and also about how can we take, like life at the margins, we don't always have to be within that system.
I think that's true, actually. There's a real conflict in someone like me, because I am exactly who I am because I'm just fundamentally outsider, and it might completely ruin me if I ever did become in the mainstream, and I do understand that. And perhaps it's just a sort of neurosis that the eternal outsider always does have that craving to be accepted and embraced into the warm bosom of the inside kind of thing. I think you're right. You can get away with more in some cases and prod a bit like I do and that kind of thing. So yeah, there is a tension there, and I think you're right to celebrate the margins and not say that it's necessarily just exists by virtue of a negative, by virtue of it not being in the mainstream.
Is my mic on? Might be double micing here. So I just wanted to say that with all of these issues around power, what I always think about is about, with my practice, is about me changing how I work, not expecting other people to change how they work. And I like to be challenged, so thinking about the margins and people coming from different routes, that's all fine as far as I'm concerned. I'm interested in the work, and so I will always try and take that as my root interest. And I want to be responsive, so as we developed our relationship, as Sue fed to me what she needed, I responded, and I think that as a curator, that's a really important skill to have.
Am I okay? And I think that response is essential in terms of, for example, if I'd meant some level of barrier when Jess was working with me, it would have used so much energy. It diverts the energy from your creative practice to having to manage the access aspects. But in terms of what Mike was saying, for me, I would say acquiring a disability has been, an impairment, should I say, has been my greatest gift, because now I'm doing things I'd have never even imagined, and I've found a passion for something that's beyond me. And it was the moment at which I realised those narratives can be fatal, and people do choose to end their lives if they buy into the narrative that disability means less of a life, whereas I'd say it's just a different life. So it's I think there's some kind of just little catchphrases that you can have in your mind that helps then negotiate the practicalities involved. The one practical thing I would say, though, is engaging with organisations like Disability Arts Online and Dash and so on to, if there is an opportunity, to then create opportunities that then go out specifically into that, through those routes. Certainly my practice exists through a series of opportunities that were targeted towards professional disabled artists, deaf and disabled artists. So I think it's valuable.
So I'm thinking about like power and agency, and you're now at a stage where you're not knocking on the art world's door. People are coming to you to say, can we show, and that degree of power and agency that you have, and your ability to articulate your needs and your desires about how the artwork is shown, or what your access requirements are. Because I remember being like a very emerging artist and thinking, I can't ask for anything, and I'm just really grateful that I'm actually getting paid to do this, and and withstood some really poor conditions and commissions. But so that gives you that agency to go to Jess and say, well, either this happens or we're not showing it.
And the other thing is, actually, I have not very much capacity, so many more people are asking me to do things, and they just don't get a response, partly because of the barriers around the written word, and if I don't have access support in place, well, one person will get an obscenely long email that will take you 3 days to read, and nobody else will get an answer because of this way of thinking. But ironically, thinking about the margins and what Mike was saying is what you could see as a limitation, my lack of ability, or the restriction in my ability to engage, is actually then, because there's an auto reply and it says, please do persist.
I know.
You're not. And the people that I work with have probably sent 4 or 5 emails before they get a response. And so it's a weeding. My barriers, in one sense, become an asset for my practice, because by the time they get a response, they're really ready to have a conversation, even if it's a really extended, extremely detailed response.
Do you have anything to add, George?
I guess this question of finding value in the margins and taking power away from mainstream institutions. I guess some of this comes back to money. I guess certainly as public funding has been eroded, the commercial galleries have become more powerful because those public institutions are after that money. So I guess it's a responsibility of larger institutions, right? And I think that there's a kind of often a conservatism in terms of programming and a celebrity culture and having the same names, not mentioning any names, but I think it's a responsibility of larger institutions to take more risks and to fail in more creative ways. And smaller institutions certainly operating regionally to do something different and not just ape what the mainstream is. Otherwise, nothing will change. So, it's often as a curator, I try to think, when you do a project, it's trying to understand what the value of that project is. Sometimes you have money, sometimes you have no money. Sometimes you think, well, maybe I can create visibility here, or maybe I can create more critical awareness for an artist's work. So your role as a curator is always trying to figure out what the value is to different people and trying to translate that value. And it's completely different in a small organisation, a large organisation, and I've worked in both. So I think this is something I think a lot about, definitely.
Over to Joe for some social media.
Can I ask a question for myself?
Yeah.
Particularly from Anna, I was interested. It was really interesting in what you had to say and about people meeting you halfway, and I really what that would mean. Like if traditional like networking and the ways you're told you're supposed to. Accessible to you, like just because yeah. That is. And then a question from the online Facebook group is how do artists find curators who have the same interests as them or similar interests?
So how do artists find curators who have similar interests?
And vice versa, I guess, as well.
And what would be meeting halfway, Anna?
Gosh. Do I need that, or is my thing?
Yeah, I've been told to use this.
Oh, hello. It's actually really, really difficult. I think it's a completely valid question to try and pin me down to something like pragmatic, and I'm not quite sure how to sort of say it without going round all the people who kind of give you rejections and say, well, what was it about this that you didn't like? I can take from it that there's something about how I package myself that isn't the norm, and that's partly to do with the art I'm making, partly to do with how I'm talking about it. And for some reason, it's not acceptable. It's not, they're not. There's something they can't quite engage about it, and sometimes it's because they think it's overly conceptual and overly intellectual. Sometimes it's because it's about stuff that isn't usually tackled in the art world. There's all sorts of different reasons, but I think it just comes down to fundamentally being something that's slightly outside of their comfort zone, and I think it's about changing their cognitive scripts and sort of saying, if something is packaged in the language that I don't understand, or is about a subject that I don't understand, it doesn't necessarily mean it's quite subconscious. I think when people just are faced with something that they're a bit uncomfortable with, and I don't think they even think about it. They just think, oh, this is in the no pile, and actually maybe it's about confronting their own kind of subconscious knee-jerk reactions about what they accept and what they reject and why, and examining that a little bit more. And I think sometimes it's just boldness. Like I think with a lot of things, the more shit, a lot of people say, oh, it's never on the CV, it's on the work you send in. That is such bullshit. There's loads and loads of wanting to cover your own back and wanting to give a position to someone because if you can see that they've had 3 residencies before, then it's okay to give them another residency. And getting that first residency when you ain't got the CV is really, really hard. So there's an extent to which people just aren't very brave to put themselves out there and give someone whose art might be good a chance, but who doesn't have, that kind of stuff behind them. Is that right?
Yeah. Any other comments from the room? No?
There was a few things that people said that were really interesting.
Can you just say who you are?
Oh, yeah, my name's Sam. I work as a curator at Litherland Gallery in, North Kent or South London, depending on which way you look at it. Just that, a few things. So it was interesting what George was saying about listening as opposed to authorship as a curator, I think was really interesting. And then also what you were saying about language and the importance of language for artists and being able to articulate your own art practice, and then how curators then kind of connect with that in some way. I think it's so important, especially when things are text-based. And then thirdly, Aidan, what you were saying at the start about perhaps a kind of duty for artists to nurture a kind of critical reflection, space for critique within themselves. And it felt like there needs to be a kind of pincer movement of artists nurturing that kind of critical space and finding ways to articulate their work in their own ways and in their own terms, but then also for artists, for curators to seek out artists who are at the outside, who are at the margins. So really that responsibility, a big call out really for curators to kind of make that effort and to come out of their kind of usual circles and to make the effort to visit artists in different spaces. Yeah, and I felt like there was a kind of urgency to say that. I don't know if it's more of a kind of comment. I don't know if anybody has anything.
And how would you, so if we're going to have a conversation as an artist and a curator, how would you facilitate that?
I would invite you down to the gallery. I mean, for us, we're always inviting artists into our gallery that we're able to work with. We're limited by geography due to funding, but it's inviting everybody for a conversation.
Thank you. Any other comments from the room? Or yeah?
Hiya. My name's Esme. I find the term artist quite tough to say. I'm an artist, but I guess that's what I am. No one would ever find me anywhere apart from in my own home. Nice to meet you. I don't know exactly who you are and what you do. I like the art speak. I find my heart starts to beat faster because I don't know if I really understand everything that people are talking about. I came to art very much from having illness and having chronic pain and looking for an out, looking for a way to deal with it. Listening to all these things, I feel like you said, it's about taking risks. And I think art in some way is about some kind of discomfort or feeling of, I want to know more, or I don't want to look at this, but I do. You know, I think about critiquing yourself. You know, at first, if anybody thought about critiquing me, I probably would have fallen into a ball and cried. Now I feel like critique is important, and I think taking steps out of your office to come to things like open spaces. I did something in Birmingham this year called Open Spaces, where people came to me, grannies came to me, but equally people who buy art came to my house. They came to see what I did in my space. And that's probably the most comfortable I've ever felt doing an exhibition, because I had time, I shared a biscuit and a cup of tea, and it was just me. And I think people coming out of their comfort zones into someone else's space, it's not necessarily that comfortable to come to somebody else's house necessarily. It could be cramped, it could be messy, but actually it's their creative space. And so for me, the world of online, you know, Etsy, Art Bubble, all of these things to me are quite anxiety provoking. But as a maker and an artist, I would love to think that maybe one day a piece of art of mine on a wall in the Mac, for example. So it is about kind of finding that huge crevice. Like, I feel like the art world, the film industry, like I've been listening to these words and thinking, it sounds impenetrable, if that's the right word. You know, I don't really feel like I'm in the same world, but I do paint, I do make things, I find things on the street and create things. So I guess I'm an artist. I'm also disabled and unable to work in other fields. But I feel like, you know, I almost feel like an outsider being here, but I'm so glad that I'm able to be here. Does that make sense? I feel like it's kind of, I don't know, it's finding that margin, it's finding that kind of fine line between someone wanting to know more and someone being able to give more. Like, I can't work really, but I would love to have a chat. You know, it's finding that balance between someone feeling comfortable to go to an opening or just hanging out, having a coffee downstairs and talking about what you enjoy to paint. I think it's finding that kind of middle ground. I don't know if you think that's relevant.
I think it's a really good point to make, because the idea of an art world is kind of an amorphous kind of way of describing it, isn't it? Because like I do a lot of teaching and talk to students, and they always talk about what it means to have success in the art world. And I'm like, well, there's multiple art worlds, and you have to kind of make sense of a career in the way that feels comfortable to you. And similarly, I remember 10 years ago, I started doing my first shows when I was curating in my front room, because I couldn't find another space. Nobody would give me their gallery. I was emailing people, and people were rejecting. I was just not getting any responses. And doing that and gave me the confidence to then get issues right and build. I don't think you can, you know, those things kind of work incrementally. But I know lots of artists that. You know, like how do we define success? Is it having work in the Tate collection and selling your work for lots of money, or is it actually your work making an impact on somebody? It doesn't have to be lots of people. It could just be one person. It could be important to you because it makes you feel good, and that's success. And I think this is a really important point to make. Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Do you want to add anything?
I just wanted to say that I love visiting artists in their home, mostly because I'm incredibly nosy. Yeah, I'm very, very nosy. But also, you know, I've been into all kinds of unusual places to see art and visit artists, and a lot of curators are very happy to do that on invitation, and it's about how you meet people in the first place. The art world can seem very scary from the outside when you're trying to get started, and one of the things that I always strive for is to put a friendly face on the art world, because we're all just people at the end of the day, and we're all just doing jobs, and we're all trying to, you know, a lot of us are trying to do the right thing, and we're trying to be helpful, and, you know, we're trying to do as much as we can within our job roles. So I'm always around Mac. I'm always here for a chat. Anyone who's interested, I try and make myself available. As I said earlier, I'm only one person, but I think that friendly approach is really important. Trying not to use art speak, trying to be as useful as possible to artists. I think that I also wanted to just say that if you're interested in finding curators that have similar interests to you, then you just have to look at the programming a lot of the time. And that's as easy as looking on the website of an institution and seeing the kind of things that are happening. And if you see things that resonate with you, there's a good chance there's a curator somewhere in that institution that is interested in the same things. So that's a good way of finding us.
I actually visited just a couple of weeks ago here to go to the cinema, and I saw a collection here of adults with autism who had been sort of institutionalized. And I, as a carer of people like that for many years, I just found that so inspiring to see. They could have been just the people that the service users I worked with, and they've all got stories. And it was so nice to actually just look in the case and see them writing things and see pictures about them and things of interest to their lives. And it was lovely to see that. So thank you for actually showing something like that.
So I think that's send the emails and get the kettle on, isn't it?
I have my usual kind of slightly disruptive response, more to your response actually, which is that there's a kind of received wisdom I've heard quite a lot that's been said to me by more successful artists than me, which is actually you don't approach curators and gallerists, they want to find you. And there was quite a famous article at one point written in one of the American magazines where it was sort of described as a kind of prey and hunter situation. And if you come to them, they haven't had to hunt you, they don't want you, you know, you're too easy, they want to find you. And I think there's kind of a truth to that. As you say, you receive these hundreds of emails, and actually for most curators, they're not even going to look at them. There has to be, and again, if you haven't gone to the opening and networked to the curator and spoken to them so that they'll look at your work, it's really difficult. And I think it's brilliant that you're really open to having chats with people, but I'm gonna lay money that does not describe 95% of curators, that availability. Although I appreciate what you're saying, you're all real people and stuff.
Yeah.
But I think that the thing with curatorial practice
is that everybody works in a different way as well. So every single individual curator is going to respond to an approach in a different way. And you're also tied to your institution. Well, I'm tied to an institution. Sometimes you're freelance, you've got more, you know, but you've got to think about what your institution is interested in as well, and the strategies, and there's aims and objectives, and there's funders, and there's all kinds of other things that are pressures on curators for who we can talk to and who we can't talk to sometimes. And, you know, that's probably something that really needs to be broken down and changed. But until the entire funding structure and how the entire art world works, it's something that we've got to try and operate within.
Well, I didn't mean to have a go over.
No. I'm not being defensive at all. And I completely agree with you. I think, you know, everybody does work in a really different way, and there's going to be a lot of people that won't answer that email. But what I always try to do is lead by example, and what I just want everybody to know is that there are curators out there who are really interested in what you do, and we do want to hear from you. It might just take a bit of time for us to email you back sometimes.
The discussion about the art world, I think partly one of the powers we have about being on the margins is to disrupt, as you were saying as well. And because for me, it was about, because I didn't find constructive narratives when I started to use the wheelchair, that it encapsulated my experience. So it was a process of just creating my own narrative. And I think that's what many of us have to do anyway, because we all have unique experiences and barriers. Some are more built in to the structure of our society. But I think there is, for me, I've never had that experience of there being an art world. I was just doing something I absolutely loved, absolutely to the best I could, and really, you know, because of issues around impairment, it took everything I could to do it. But you were mentioning about inviting people into your homes. I can imagine that was a really precious space for those people who came. So I don't think it's necessarily about scale. As George was saying, I think it's about impact, and I'm coming from a perspective of seeing an arts practice about building social capital and social value. So for me, it started off with enabling other people to, hopefully saving other people the 10 years I lost in negotiating negotiating the identity work, and then wanting, I'm going to say an autoethnographic process, which just means I looked at my own experience, worked out what the barriers were for me, and then started innovating, thinking of how I could transcend that, both for myself and for other people, because that was what was meaningful for me. Because once I understood it was purely about concepts and ideas, and it wasn't deliberate, it's just historical, that then does that answer what you're saying? It just evolved naturally, not in a didactic process, but just out of necessity. I absolutely had to for myself. And then I realized that finding a way to have meaning in the context of having lost a previous career, that's how the art became meaningful to me, because of its power, the power the imagery might have to speak without words. And I have the privilege of an arts training, which definitely does push you through a range of ways of thinking about the world. But equally, that process can be disabling, because it can put you in a box and say this is the only acceptable, or you get the sense that your work, you could see it happening to people on the course that some people's work was more acceptable, or there was a feeling that it fitted in with the trend. So it can be a barrier as well for some people, and it is a talent. It stimulates you to find your own narrative, I would say.
I mean, sorry, can I just comment that it's like George responding to my tweet. It's like that's totally out of the blue. But I think that there's a massive difference between an authentic engagement and somebody who can do buzzword bingo as far as like kind of the creative case and diversity goes, but actually doesn't have any authenticity or care around it. And I think there's also a fear of institutions and people getting it wrong, whereas I much prefer approach where it's okay to get it wrong as long as you're trying and as long as you learn from it. You know, and then the fact that George had an authentic encounter, or that we had an authentic encounter, has then led on to, like, you know, George being present, but he's also, you were talking about walking the walk and talking the talk. And I think having one person on board, or two people on board who have that approach, it kind of shows that it can be done, that we don't have to just maintain that old construct of the art world. There's a question over there, but do you want to respond?
I just wanted to say that as a curator, every conversation you have, you learn something from, and that's why I responded to the tweet. You know, I think often in the art world, if I'm to criticise it, it's always looking upwards and not necessarily thinking about how we build opportunities. And, you know, I often say that the curator's job is to build bridges and ladders, because I remember what it felt like to try and get access to the art world. So yeah, I just feel like you're always trying to put yourself in a position of learning and listening. Yeah.
I think to a degree some people pull up the ladder because they feel comfortable. Sorry.
Hi. My name's Eleanor and I'm an artist and a student, but I don't study art. I know people have spoken about not being able to physically get to openings and networking and everything, which is the same with me. I don't go to any of those sorts of things. But I wanted to ask in terms of like what people thought of accessibility using digital stuff, because the only show I've ever had a piece in, I got through social media, and sort of how much do you use social media to get to people that don't get to your events, because that was the only thing I've ever got, and that was where someone saw what I was doing and asked me specifically. And so that is something I found obviously helpful. But how much do you use that, and how much do you think that should be used to find artists?
Who wants to start there?
Well, I think it's incredible. I think it's an incredible tool, digital. And I mean, right, I ran out of time when I was doing my 10 minutes, but digital was the last thing on my list. Social media is a great tool for talking to people and having conversations. Twitter's one of my favourite things. I'm all over Twitter. And I think it's really important to that it enables you to have conversations with people that you wouldn't normally get to meet, that are outside of your social circles and outside of your usual routes when you go through. Although those pesky algorithms are ruining a lot of that for us. But yeah, I think it's a really useful tool. Definitely. It could probably be used more. We could probably exploit that more. And yeah, it would be interesting to look at that.
Yeah, just to reiterate that, really, I use it constantly to kind of understand what the conversations are happening, as much as looking at work. And my personal experience that social media has enabled me to have a voice outside of institutions. I've got a lot of work through it. So like writing gigs or people getting in contact with me. It's a way of building community. And again, that's another role that a curator, I think, has to do, is to build communities. It's not just about putting shows on, but understanding how to build an arts community within a city. But certainly it's also institutions I've worked at. Digital is just an extension of a footfall into the space. It's not like, it is a native thing that you talk about, your social media reach. And, you're getting new jobs being created at the moment in digital curation. There's been some interesting roles that have come up. So yeah, I use it constantly to find artists.
Either of...
I think it's sort of like everything else. If it's a tool you can use, it's a brilliant tool. If it's something that you struggle with and have difficulty with, it becomes another area in which you're kind of shut out because you're aware that somehow all these artists are on Instagram and they're getting found by curators and things, and you feel kind of excluded from that because it's not your world. So for everything that can be an accessible route for one person, it can also be a huge barrier to another, I think.
Am I on my mic? Yeah. So for me, because text is very challenging, and what I think I've read doesn't necessarily correlate with what was actually said. it's an interesting process. I really believe in digital in terms of reversing the process of using headsets to take artworks into people's homes, which is some research I did with Trish through freewheeling in the past, which did have a really positive response. So it's slightly different to what you're saying, but I can see networks and social media can be a really effective way to build a community if physically accessing the world is challenging. But it's again, perhaps it's possible for me, I can use it as a creative strategy or make artwork around the amusing typos that occur when I'm trying to create responses. And Trish actually suggested I use Twitter to try and limit myself to 140 characters, which is very, very challenging.
Do we have any other comments? Quick comment?
Just one more very quickly. I think I just wondered what your thoughts are about moving curation beyond from competition to conversation. So just picking up on a lot of the other previous comments, looking at the people that get left behind. So when you have open calls and you get the winners, but what about the losers? What's happening to them, and how is the sector actually as a whole, as a networked entity rather than just individual institutions, actually engaging with those people? Because it can actually be done. There is actually enough when people work together through systems like CVAN and so on, you can actually reach a lot more people and make sure that people are actually looked after. And the other thing is being positive about disability, so making sure that people are actually, during open calls, if you say you have a disability, then you're guaranteed a conversation, an interview or whatever.
Okay. Can we take? Is there another couple of quick questions in the room? Perhaps somebody who hasn't asked before. There's.
I just very, very quickly, my name's Brian, I'm an artist. I just wanted to know Anna's gruesome story about, you mentioned at the beginning about a horror story with the curator.
Me too.
Is there another question? Does anybody want to take those two? Anna's terrible story and competition to conversation.
So I've sat on a lot of panels for open calls and commissions, and I think what's interesting about that process is you often come across a lot of artists that aren't even shortlisted that are fantastic. I mean, it's kind of regular to go through 300-400 submissions to find like 5 people to interview. But that's not to say that the people who aren't getting shortlisted aren't really interesting, and often you're encountering their work and those conversations can carry on. So definitely, but I think we certainly need less competitiveness in the art world and more care and more conversation. So that, yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say, really.
Okay. Does anybody, I wanted this to have a conversation. Does anybody have anything burning that they've been wanting to ask for the last 2 hours? I'm going to come back and just ask for a final comment.
Could I respond to this question about building network?
Briefly.
So I think the reason I'm here is an example of networks that have been built. Dash and Dow, who are both in the room, are tremendous advocates for disabled artists. Personally, I can thank Mike for sustaining my practice at a point when I might have completely fallen off the radar. So that takes, he's the director of an organisation, so that's a personal, tremendous commitment, and I know he's done it for a number of other neurodiverse artists specifically. So that's about the community and the commitment Dash had demonstrated. So I completely agree that you know, while I may appear to be in a different position, it has been completely built on that commitment to inclusion and engagement, that it starts with individuals, but then it translates into changing the expectations for whole organisations. And the other thing is, I think it's because it's a mutually beneficial process that once people engage and it moves from a dichotomy into a sense of a continuum, then people really actively engage with the creativity of that process and find it adds really exciting dimensions. But as you say, networks and that focus.
Okay, is there anybody who does have that burning question that they haven't asked, that they're going to get on the train and think, ah, if only? Okay.
Hello, I'm an artist from Manchester. I want to know, what exactly does the word or phrase outside art mean?
I think briefly, the common understanding is that somebody who exists outside of the traditional field of the art world, and those who don't have a traditional art training, so maybe self-trained artists, people, you know, that kind of genre or world, rather than kind of coming through the normative process.
It's more than that, though.
I was just trying to be succinct.
Oh, okay, so 30 seconds. There's a weird inverse snobbery about this, and particularly in France with the kind of art brut stuff, that you're supposed to be, you know, like properly institutionalized, and then you're an outsider art. And if you're kind of in the world but disabled, but not in an institution, you're not proper outsider artist. And then there's a lot of this, like with what you were talking about earlier with invisible disabilities, and whether if people can't see your disability, are you disabled enough to be called an outsider artist? So there's all this kind of ridiculous kind of politics, which is partly defined from people outside disability on a basis of how disabled you look to them on seeing you for 10 seconds. Kind of thing.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much. I would just like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank the tech people, the interpreters. The palantypists, Mac Birmingham for having us here, Dow for putting the event on, and I'd like you to say thank you to George Vasey, Jess Litherland, Anna Berry, and Sue Austin. And thank yourselves for coming. And thank you. I do also want to say that for me, this is just the beginning of these kind of conversations. I think it's really important that this is, you know, I go to a lot of conferences, might be about the creative case, and we're talking about the same thing time after time. I really want these conversations to push things on, so we're not having the same conversations, so that disabled artists are accessing the world which they want to access, and we are having the critical spaces and creating that, and we're having the conversations.
And as disabled artists, we can create those opportunities through our practices. So one of my things is about the creating opportunities to engage through the artwork, through employing other people with disabilities to work within my core access support team. But also another aim would be, if I do eventually get a studio, to make that available to create a residency, if it ever happens and is suitable, for another disabled artist in the way I was started. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. And then if you do have any other final comments, the hashtag is Interrogating Invisibility. And so if you do have the thing that you want to say or comment on the afternoon, then you can do that on Twitter with that hashtag.
So it just needs to say, feedback forms, please. And also a big thanks to Aidan for putting this conversation together. It's been great.
Thank you.